So we'd like to make a start. We have two speakers this morning, Richard Baldwin and Mari Pangestu, before we break for morning tea. So I'm not really going to do anything now except hand over to Stephanie Honey, who's going to chair the first session. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you, Jennifer. Tēnā koutou katoa and atamarie on this lovely but very early Saturday morning start. Now, as Jennifer said, my name is Stephanie Honey. I'm a trade policy consultant and former negotiator for the government. So, you know, as the sort of uber trade nerd, I must say I'm absolutely thrilled to be here. And it's very shortly going to be my great pleasure and honour to introduce Richard Baldwin. But because digital is such a strong theme in our Auckland Trade and Economic Policy School, we're really going to live our values. So I have to give a housekeeping notice, which is that if you have questions for Richard as he goes through, we encourage you to get out your device and log into Slido, which is www.sli.do, Slido. The code is on a small piece of paper on your chairs, but it's #Z238, and put your most provocative and difficult questions into the system and we will put them to Richard on your behalf. So please make use of that facility, but of course we'll also have the opportunity for questions at the end. But let me turn to Richard Baldwin. Now, I'm sure Richard is very well known to many of you. He's famous not just for his thought leadership on the impact of the digital revolution on trade and the future of work, but also for inventing a range of fancy new terms. Globotics, probably the most current of them, but as we were chatting earlier, this idea of unbundling as well. So he's a thought leader, but also a vocabulary leader. Now, Richard is Professor of International Economics at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, but he's also Editor-in-Chief of the fantastic portal, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, voxeu.org, which he founded. Now, Richard has had an extremely distinguished career. He completed his PhD at MIT under the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman and has written 6 articles with him. And he's subsequently held a range of impressive positions, including senior staff economist for the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the Bush the Elder administration, visiting professor at Oxford at MIT, director and president of the Centre for Economic Policy Research, and has sat on is sitting on the World Economic Forum's Stewardship Board on Trade and Investment. And in his spare time, which I'm sure he doesn't have a lot of, Richard also advises and consults with numerous governments and international organisations on international trade and globalisation issues. Now, Richard is best known for his 2 most recent books. In 2016, The Great Convergence, which was cited by the Financial Times and The Economist as one of the best books of 2016, and his most recent work, The Globotics Upheaval, which I believe is available for sale at the bookshop or on Amazon, or I'm sure Richard would be happy to autograph a copy if you brought one with you. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage Richard Baldwin. Please join me in welcoming him.
Well, sorry, I can't speak Maori, but welcome this morning. Now, this is a very international crowd, and you've probably heard talks all over the world. And, you know, when you're in Asia, it's sort of standard to start with an apology. But in America, it's sort of standard to start with a joke. But we don't have any time this morning. I have to get through 500 pages of 2 books in 40 minutes, so here it goes. Sorry, I don't have a joke. What I want to talk about this morning is these 2 books, Tech and Trade, which you so kindly mentioned, The Great Convergence and The Globotics Upheaval. And what I'm going to do is spend a few minutes summarizing what the whole rest of the talk will be. So in case the coffee conks out and you go to sleep in the middle of the talk, you'll at least have known what I was trying to say. It's always embarrassing. You can do the whole 40-minute talk in 4 slides, but here we go. I'd like you to, and I'm looking at technology and trade, how it works. So I'd like you to think about the old globalization this way. Think about a world with sort of 2 types of countries, headquarter economies on one hand, and factory economies on the other. You can think about it as a G7 and say, the emerging markets. Now, in the old globalization, inside the country, the headquarter economies, there was a high know-how to labor ratio, which supported a high wages. And the country would take its high technology, high wages, and whatever else it has in terms of sources of comparative advantage, and make stuff. Could be clothes, or cows, or computers. They were making stuff. And those things competed in a world market, the goods only. Source of comparative advantage, goods market competition internationally. And the factory economy have low know-how to labor ratio. That led to low wages, and they could also make clothes, cows, and computers, and the clothes, cows, and computers competed with those from the G7 in international markets. So this was the old globalization. It was essentially competition in goods based on national comparative advantage. In my 2016 book, but actually it goes to work, I went back to 2006, I pointed out that the ICT created the new globalization. In particular, information and communication technology created the new globalization by opening a new pipeline for the arbitrage of knowledge. That pipeline is the GVC revolution. What really changed around 1990 with technology and trade was that the source of comparative advantage in the G7 could be taken outside of the G7 countries and combined with nearby low-wage labor in developing countries. That denationalized comparative advantage, and it allowed developing countries to produce goods that they could never have produced with their own technology, at least not for decades. So instead of competition happening only in goods based on national sources of comparative advantage, the sources of comparative advantage were moving across countries. And since this was know-how, which is a fuel of modern growth, it sparked rapid industrialization in a handful of developing countries who were close to the G7. That led to rapid income growth in those countries, which triggered a commodity supercycle which lasted for a couple years, for a couple decades. So that's the story for me. Technology opened the pipeline. G7 firms took their own firm-specific technology in manufacturing, combined it with low-wage labor, and created a new type of competition. High-tech plus low wages revolutionizes manufacturing. And it's why countries like New Zealand, who are trying to do it with high-tech, high wages, and countries like Brazil and South Africa, who are trying to do it with low-tech, low wages, were completely blown out of the water by China, who was doing it with high-tech and low wages. New world. Now, in my new book, I'm talking about the future of globalization. This is digital technology opens a pipeline for international wage competition. This will be a very different type of competition. It's no longer just taking national sources of comparative advantage, making goods, and then exporting the goods in a competitive market. It's labor from low-wage countries moving into high-wage offices and working remotely without migrating. I like to call it telemigration. I think this is the future wave of globalization. Of course, it's the future, so we can talk about whether it's true or not. But don't write down what I say, write down the logic I'm using. And the logic of this is based on the fact that the largest price differences in the world left today is in the price for service workers, which is frequently 10 or 20 to 1. You can look up the facts. Accountants, doctors, cab drivers, frequently you have a 20 to 1 difference. And digital technology is allowing our companies to arbitrage those differences, to buy the labor cheaper abroad and use it in offices at home in the service sector. That is completely different than the globalization we've been used to, because it's not based on goods. It's based on services. Now, there's enough trade nerds in the room, so I can call this Mode 1 services, but that wouldn't be sexy whatsoever, so I called it telemigration. But I'm acknowledging that trade and services is opening up due to digital technology, and that will open up a new phase of globalization, which hurts and helps the service sector in rich countries and poor countries. Now, what I think this is going to do is create a global talent tsunami, which will fundamentally change the world of work in the emerging markets and in the rich countries. So in some sense, you could say the 1990s was a story of hundreds of millions of low-cost manufacturing workers joining the global manufacturing workforce. And that completely transformed industry in the G7 countries, and with the combination of high-tech, low wages, also blew out of the water most of the other emerging markets who weren't participating in global value chains. In the 2020s, I think a similar thing will happen in the service sector, as hundreds of millions of low-cost, talented foreign service workers join the service world. And this idea that services are non-traded is changing rapidly, and the talent tsunami will come to the service sector instead. Okay, so I'm going to only talk about trade, but my book, The Globotics, is smashing together globalization and automation to stress the point that digital technology is doing both. And going back the last couple decades, there was a big dialogue. Was it automation or was it globalization? Going forward, I think we ought to stop thinking about that distinction because it's both. Automation of service jobs and globalization of service jobs are happening at the same time, driven by the same technology and affecting the same groups of workers. Okay, so now let me talk a little bit more about the future of globalization, spinning out this telemigration stuff. And as it says here, the future is unknowable, but also inevitable, which is why I'm talking about stuff where there's no data, there's no facts. It's speculation based on my experience and my thoughts. So the question is, what happens when digital technology makes remote workers much less remote? That's the pipeline. So let's think that through. What will happen then? What I want to stress at this point, but admitting in this audience that trade and services is just going to increase and is increasing. Sherry was telling us yesterday, or at least at dinner, I can't remember where you told us, that it's over half. Maybe it was on the panel. You told us already it's over half, it's growing much faster, and if you measured it properly, it'd probably even be much more than that, especially if we took into account Mode 5 services, whereas Lucien, he's been doing the calculations for us. That's much bigger than you think. But this one I'm going to talk about because I think it will touch average people. And embedded services and all that, that's fairly abstract for most people, but this is going to be international freelancing, international telecommuting. Instead of just telecommuting from a suburb of Auckland into offices in Auckland on Friday afternoons, it's going to be happening from the Philippines or somewhere else. So wage gaps make it profitable. So look around the wage gaps of the world next time you do your statistics. They are fantastically large. That is what's driving it. That's a big, tempting thing for companies to invest in whatever they need to be able to do that arbitrage. Digitech makes it possible. Now, I want to talk about how Digitech enables telemigration. I'm going to focus on 4 things. First one, domestic remote work paves the way. So I asked this at a talk here in Auckland earlier this week, and apparently not that many people telecommute in New Zealand. But in the United States, it's something like 40% of the people work remotely at least some of the time, and in Europe it's growing very quickly. Now, many people do this because it's convenient, and the workers often like doing it. But what I'd like to point out is that means that your companies and organizations are rearranging work so that remote workers can be slotted into the team. They're switching to collaborative software that's in the cloud, which can be accessed anywhere. They're investing in telecommunications equipment, which makes the face-to-face much easier to do, and changing to communication systems like Slack or Basecamp or Trello, which makes remote teams easier to manage. They're going to matrix structure, agile, project-based rather than vertical silos. All those things which they're doing to allow domestic telecommuting will make it easier to do international telecommuting. And once they've arranged things so that remote workers can be slotted in for particular tasks in a project, it won't take them very long to figure out that they could get part of the same services for 1/10 or 1/20 of the price. Now, using foreign remote workers will never be quite as good as using domestic in-person workers, but it's going to be a whole lot cheaper. So what do you think is going to happen? The second bit is these online matchmaking platforms. How many of you have heard of Upwork? Used Upwork? Okay, look it up on the internet, not just right now, but after I'm done talking. It's going to revolutionize the world. How many of you have heard of eBay? Okay. Upwork is eBay for services. eBay allows people who have stuff, who want to sell it, to find people who want to buy stuff online through matchmaking and search things. It underpins the financial transaction that's required even when it's international and provides some sort of quality assurance that the whole thing will go well. Upwork does that for services. Could be copy editing, translation, logo design, software issues, whatever you want. Tutorials in economics or mathematics, you can get this all online. And there's a systems competition going on, a platform competition. There's dozens of freelance platforms that are competing to become the Amazons of the next generation. So Upwork went public last year. It was worth over $1 billion, and it's growing about 20% per year. So this is relatively small now, but growing at an explosive pace. You won't be surprised that there's a new Chinese entrant to this called Witmart, and inside China, Zubaiji, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing, sorry about that, is domestic telecommuting in services in China is huge, and much of it goes through the Zubaiji, and they've just now got an English language version, which together with machine translation is going to bring out a lot of talent very quickly. So the third is advanced telecoms. Even people my age have been shocked by how good the telecoms have gotten in the last 5 years, if not 10 years, so I don't have to say anything about that. Remote people feel a lot less remote this year than they did 5 years ago, even than 3 years ago, even than 2 years ago. The last, and I think this is way underestimated, is machine translation. So if you haven't tried machine translation recently, you should try it, because it's getting better at an explosive pace. There was a big breakthrough in 2016 when the UN put online millions of hand-translated sentences in the UN 6 official languages. So if you speak one of those languages, the geniuses at Amazon and Google, Twitter, have used algorithms and machine learning to train models which translate sentence by sentence, not word by word, and that was the big breakthrough. And now it's coming into our lives. Twitter, for example, you just translate that tweet and it goes. YouTube, you can say subtitles automatic, and it listens to the foreign language, translates it into English, and puts on a subtitle in real time. So this machine translation is working well. Now, if you don't have masses of data in your language, it can't do this at all. It's terrible. So if you're speaking an obscure dialect or Swiss German or something like that, this doesn't work at all. But if you're in one of the main languages, it is, and it's getting better very, very quickly. So just to give you an idea, when trade economists estimate trade flows between countries, the language dummy is 50%. The typical thing, if you have a common language, you trade 50% more in goods than you did before. So this, of course, isn't like everybody speaks the same language, but it's part of the way. So you can see it could have a major impact on trading goods as well as everything else. And there's a recent NBR working paper where Bryn Jolfesen and a number of co-authors got the Upwork data and looked to see where the language pairs were getting good. There's a website that shows you how good they are. And he found that where it advanced, it increased the trade in services on Upwork by 17% because of this machine translation. So it's a big thing that people, I think, are underestimating it. Okay, is this time different? And you know, when anybody puts a question on a slide, the answer is always yes. That's why I'm asking the question. So, first of all, it's affecting service and professional jobs, not just factory jobs. These guys know all about competing with robots at home and China abroad. You couldn't tell them anything about this. These people feel sorry for them when they lose their job. They think globalization is something that happens to factory workers or farmers or miners. They're not ready for globalization, and they're very different in a few ways. Office and professional workers are different. First of all, there's lots of them. 80 to 90% in the rich countries work in services. So this globalization and also automation, which I won't talk very much about today, is affecting a much larger segment of the population, and therefore potentially is much more disruptive. On the good side, these workers are more flexible and easier to re-employ. The more flexible because almost all service jobs involve a range of skills that overlap with other service jobs. So even if you're an accountant, you have skills of reading, writing, participating in meetings, keeping still and being a nice guy in the office. Those carry over to other services. Unlike factories and farmers and miners, they had trouble porting their skills over to something else. The second thing is most of these people work in cities, and they live in the cities where there are lots of jobs. So when the turnover happens, it's not the disaster. And lastly, they're not ready for it. Services have been non-traded forever, and it's been non-automatable because computers couldn't really think. And digital technology is changing both of those realities at an explosive pace. These guys aren't ready for it, and that's what puts the upheaval in my title, the Globotics Upheaval. I think it's very likely that the service sector workers in advanced economies will feel threatened by globalization in new ways and automation, and join together potentially with the blue-collar workers who've had problems the last 2 decades to create a great big mess. And if you want to see this translated into a political agenda, look up Andrew Yang, who is a presidential candidate in the United States. The last one, he's going to be on the debate. He was the last one to make the debate. And he tells a story of how the real culprit is technology, the automation of service jobs. Earlier on in his campaign, he was also talking about offshoring. So it was like Globotics perfect. Actually, he's in my book, so I didn't copy him, but I was looking around. There must be somebody who's found this. And he won't become president. I think he polls at like 0.5% or something. But the theme that the scapegoat should be technology rather than China or migrants, that will be very attractive to left-leaning candidates around the world. Because in all the rich countries, people are feeling uneasy, a dis-ease. There's something wrong with the system. And right now, you can blame it on immigrants or trade. This allows you to be mad about big tech or small tech or tech in general. Okay, Digitech is ICT. Digital technology is information and communication technology. It is the same technology, but I'm going to argue that it's having entirely different economic effects. So, digital technology is about storing, processing, gathering, and transmitting information. And it's subject to these doubling every 2-year law, Moore's law, Gilder's law, stuff like that, okay? Now, ICT was applied to manufacturing, at least in terms of the globalization. That was a pipeline that allowed the know-how to go out of G7 and into emerging market factories. But in manufacturing, it's mostly physical with just a little bit of information and communication. Digitech is being applied to services, which is mostly I and C, and only a little bit of physical. That makes all the difference, because it means a different physics applies. When you're talking about global value chains and trading goods, it's the laws of matter which constrain things. This is all in the background. It's not in our models. But when you think about how fast can things change, and you're thinking about globalization over the last 2 decades, you are implicitly using the laws of matter to say, how fast could I double imports and exports? In services, It's governed mostly by the laws of electronics, of electrons and photons, which are very different laws of physics. For example, if you ask, how long would it take to double the world flows of imports and exports? The answer is 2 decades, because you have double the ports, double the cargo ships. That stuff takes time to build. The flows of information across borders have doubled every 2 years for the last 10 years and will probably double every 2 years going forward. So if you're judging what's going to happen in the next few years based on how fast it happened in the last 2 decades, you're just using the wrong physics, and you almost surely will underestimate how fast it will impact the world of work. Today's AI is different. In 2019, computers can read, write, see, speak, understand speech, create visual output, recognize subtle patterns. Some of them can even speak as fast as me. That's a joke. You guys are supposed to. Okay. How about this? I'll say something, I'll stop talking and look expectant. That's when you're supposed to laugh. Okay, should we practice? Okay. In any case, in 2015, computers couldn't do that, so what changed? My answer is the programming is different. So, and I want to get at this by talking about this book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, which won a psychologist a Nobel Prize in economics. And he's pointing out, as something psychologists have known for a long time, or at least it's very common, that there's 2 ways that humans speak. And most psychologists call it System 1 and System 2, which would definitely not get you a Nobel Prize in economics. So Kahneman called it thinking fast and thinking slow. Now, thinking slow is what most of us call thinking. It's effortful, logical, conscious. It's very difficult for you to do 2 things at the same time because there's a logical process going through. But the most important thing is you know how you do it. You know how you do arithmetic. You know how you do trigonometry. Therefore, you can write down a sequence of logical steps called a computer program, which tells the computer what to do in every single logical possible step, but just a lot faster than you. Now, that meant that you could only get computers to do things which involve thinking slow tasks. And we did that from about 1970, spreadsheets, that kind of stuff. Machine learning is programming computers in a radically different way. What machine learning does, which is the bit of AI that you really should pay attention to, machine learning takes a lot of data, a structured data set, where the question is clear and the outcome is clear. And then what you do is you get 1 million observations of this, and you estimate a very large nonlinear statistical model by curve fitting, data mining, basically. So it's like a huge weather model, super complex, super nonlinear, and you use the data to make good guesses. And when you're done, what you actually have is a computer program in some ways, but not a set of logical steps. And as a consequence, the thing can look at a photo and say, yep, that's a cat. But if you ask it, how did you know it was a cat? Not even the AI geniuses who programmed it know it. It's a great big black box. Now, what that means is that computers have acquired a whole set of cognitive skills, which they never had before, starting basically from 2016. And what that meant is that there's a whole set of skills which can be automated now, which could not be automated before, and we're working through the automation of those things, and it's changing the world of work. In globalization, the big impact is machine translation. Machine translation's got insanely better than it was before because of this. Inequality may be different. So I know there's a standard narrative that digital technology is more ICT. ICT increased inequality, therefore this is going to be an increase in inequality on steroids. But I'm not sure that's true. Ask yourself, who gains most from the new AI tools? Below average thinkers or above average thinkers? So for example, there was a sort of a contest recently, it was written up in the New York Times, where a machine learning trained model was diagnosing childhood diseases, common childhood diseases. And they had a nurse using the AI and doctors. And the nurses using the AI won. They correctly diagnosed them more. So this AI will make the doctors more productive and help their salaries, but it'll make the nurses way more productive. So what's so different about this technology is it's dead easy to use. You do not need a university degree to use machine learning trained models. In fact, you're using them all the time and you don't even know you're using them. When you push translate tweet, that is machine learning. When Word is suggesting less wordy phrases to you, that's machine learning. Optical character recognition, that's machine learning. Handwriting recognition. You're using AI all the time, and it's designed to be super easy to use. Now, ICT back in the day worked very differently. Starting from about 1970, computerization created better substitutes for people who work with their hands and therefore undermined their value, but created better tools for people who work with their heads, thereby increasing their value. But the trick was you needed a university degree to make the new tools work. Stuff like PowerPoint and Word and Excel spreadsheets and databases, all those things, you needed a university degree, so it was fundamentally inequalizing. This one is not undermining handwork. Oh, maybe a little bit, but most of it's gone anyways. What it's doing is providing a good substitute for experience-based pattern recognition, which is what some of the best jobs in the world are now. 20 years, law, medicine, engineering, whatever. This is now machine learning and put into the hands of average people. So I'm not at all sure that this won't be good for the middle class, but I'm an optimist. So if you look at what happened, this is a share of 5% to top 5% in England. The data goes back to 1688, if you can believe it. So for the first phase, the first industrial revolution, inequality rose slightly, but from the second industrial revolution on, when things started going to a wider range of industry, inequality fell for a century because that technology was based on mechanization, which gave better tools to people who work with their hands and made them more productive, but only indirectly helped people with their heads. So technology at that time was equalizing. It was only from about 1973 with computerization where it turned around. And so I just wanted to point out that technology is not always inequalizing. Okay, I'm going to have to speed up here. How much longer do we have? 12 minutes, okay. So globotics is advancing at an explosive pace, and I guess my talk is going to have to keep at an explosive pace to get through all my slides. The minister talked about it yesterday, so mostly I'm going to skip over it, but I do think there's a systematic misthinking that people look back the last 20 years, see what happened, and figure that's what's going to happen the next 20 years, and I think that's just wrong. It's coming in ways that few expect. So it won't look like Janesville. So Janesville American Story, this was a book that won a lot of prizes in 2017, won the prizes that I thought the Great Convergence should have won, but that's just me. It's a story of a factory closure in Janesville, Wisconsin, small town in Wisconsin, and all the social ills that followed from it. You know, suicides, divorces, obesity, opioids. It's a depressing book, but it showed the human side of globalization, and many people still think of globalization that way. A factory closure. Everybody's out on their own. This time, there will be no mass unemployment Rust Belt style, I predict. It'll look more like this. I'm not sure why people laugh at that slide. You know, it happens every time. I had to buy this slide. I think they're all fake, but I think it's because people are sort of nervous and they recognize themselves in there. And they're trying to figure out, why is he showing this? I was just telling my kids last night not to use their phone, and then I pulled my phone out. So the idea here is to draw an analogy between the way iPhones changed our lives and the way telemigration will change the world of work. This did not happen overnight. In fact, if you look 10 years ago, Steve Jobs, when he announced the iPhone, he was so chuffed that it did 3 things. It was a music player, and it really was a great music player. It was a mediocre cell phone with a very short battery life. I used to call it the I can't hear you phone. And it was a web browser, which wasn't much good because there wasn't internet anywhere. There wasn't Wi-Fi anywhere. And so it did 3 things, which was wonderful, but not that many people bought them. But one innovation at a time, one convenience at a time, people started embracing these things and allowing them to become your news feed, your newspaper, your ticket agent. It changed the way you deal with cities through Google Maps and Yelps. It changed your social relations because you keep in touch with social media rather than actually talking to people or writing letters. It changed the world of work because you were always online and your boss expected your phone to be charged and accessible at any moment. But here's the thing. Nobody decided to let that happen. It just happened. And I think that's the way telemigration, other trade and services will come into the world of work. Nobody gets fired. There'll be one task done offshore. Maybe somebody to help you with the writing or the translation or to spruce up the layout of your internal newsletter. But one innovation at a time, one decision at a time, billions of seemingly small, seemingly unrelated substitutions of domestic labor for remote labor will change the world of work. And also some of us will start to export as well through services. It does go both ways. But I read a book on speaking, public speaking, and it says if you scare your audience, they pay attention more. And as you all know, like the imports are the scary part, the exports are the happy part. So if I talked happy the whole time, you wouldn't be paying attention. The questions for the trade system. And I'm going to do some blue skies thinking. So if you thought that was speculative before, just wait. So the reason I'm going to do this part is because some of you are in foreign affairs. And I think this stuff will change the world of international relations and geopolitics and geoeconomics big time. And here's my argument. How Digitech will make manufacturing jobless and non-traded, but services freely traded. So here's the story. Automation in manufacturing is proceeding, substituting robots for labor. Now, since robots are freely traded and all the inputs are freely traded, you do not get a comparative advantage on the bit of the value added that comes from robots. It costs the same in China as it does in Germany, more or less. The big cost differences depend upon the labor cost share. And automation is lowering the labor cost share. And once that labor cost share gets low enough, it won't be worthwhile making it in China and shipping it by boat to Europe. So digital technology will make manufacturing non-traded in the sense that everything will be made local. That's an extension, but you can see the logic. It also makes it jobless. So New Zealand probably will get a lot more manufacturing value added as you stop buying things made in China, but there won't be any new jobs for New Zealanders, only New Zealand robots. The same technology is making it very easy to trade labor services without crossing borders, and therefore it's making services which used to be non-traded, freely traded. Now think about what this means for emerging markets who have for 200 years relied on industrialization as the development ladder. You went from slow growth because you're poor to slow growth because you're rich. And in the meantime, you had fantastic growth based on industrialization. This is pulling out all the rungs of the industrialization ladder, which means development will have to happen some other way. So I think it's going to cause an upheaval in advanced economies, or at least there's a significant chance that that will happen if it happens very fast. But it's creating export opportunities in emerging markets. Now, it's worthwhile pointing out that globalization's inevitable challenge is that it provides more opportunities for a nation's most competitive citizens and more competition for its least competitive citizens. That's always been the case. So opening up trade and services will be good for some people in New Zealand and bad for other people in New Zealand. It will be good for some people in Kenya and bad for other people in Kenya. So it's just comparative advantage. We don't need a new theory for this. It's exactly like David Ricardo said, because there were no real goods in David Ricardo's model. Those are just a veil for trade in wage-based value added. So the emerging market miracle, my prediction is, will continue and spread. Before it was based either on manufacturing, which was highly concentrated, or commodities, which was just also fairly concentrated, maybe a little less. Now remember, the emerging market's true competitive advantage is quality-adjusted, low-cost labor. And before, their advantage was filtered through goods, and this made development difficult. So emerging markets' competitive advantage was low-cost labor. That had to go into factories, which made goods, and then competed in the international market. And since the production of goods was subject to agglomeration economies, very complex logistics requiring certain technology, most developing countries could not do it. Now they skip over the goods and export their comparative advantage directly. Services are easier. Lower scale economies, less complex supply chains and logistics, and geographic matters, distance matters less, which is why I believe it'll spread to Africa and Latin America as well. If you look at a map of the world of manufacturing, take this triangle between Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo, 40% of world manufacturing is in that circle. Another 20% is in Europe, another 20% is in North America there. The remaining is spread over the entire world. So it's extremely concentrated geographically, and that matters. Services is not going to be that way. In fact, I think time zones will matter more. I think Southeast Asia will provide the services to Northeast Asia, Africa to Europe, and Latin America to North America. We're going to have to get used to service-led development, replacing manufacturing-led development. So think India, not China. Think service value chains, not global value chains. And the service value chains are disintegrating and being outsourced. I'll skip India and China, but this is one thing I like. This is India's net export and services. As they developed, it went positive, but the goods went negative, showing a revealed comparative advantage in services. For China, it's exactly the opposite. So I think a lot more of the development experiences will look like India. Think new development strategies. Think cities, services, and training. The factories are the people, not factories, industrial equipment, and technology. All right, in the last 2 minutes, let's talk about data. Or you probably pronounce it differently, but sorry, I can't do that. We know how to regulate goods, services, IP, investment, financial capital, and migration. We have regimes for regulating those. So data flows, which of these are? Which of these they fit in? Which regime should we use to regulate data? And I would suggest to you that the discussion on regulation of data is way too blunt. Remember in the 80s, well, some of you will remember the 80s, the discussion on services was like, services trade is good or bad, we liberalize it, we don't liberalize it, and then somebody came up with the modes. And that clarified things enormously, because it turned out trade and services where I go to you versus you go to me is totally different from a regulatory perspective. And I think we need to do the same with data. I think we need much more nuance, classes of data. So with a little speculation, I haven't actually written anything on this yet, but what are the key features? I would point out durability, sensitivity, and exclusivity. Modes or classes. Class 1 is not durable, it's not sensitive, and it's not exclusive, which means it may be something that's valuable to somebody, but only for a very short period of time, so why get all bothered? It may not be sensitive, so it may just be like, what color shoes am I wearing today in Auckland? And often, it's not exclusive. Like postal addresses are personal data, but they're not exclusive. You can find them online anywhere. So why get all upset in a trade agreement about stuff that's not sensitive, not durable, and not exclusive? Class 2 would be exclusive and sensitive, but not durable. And class 3 would be exclusive, sensitive, and durable. And so we could think like, well, we'll just agree class 1 data, no problem. We'll treat it like trading goods, the freer the better. Class 2, we can talk about it. In class 3, you can't do it. It's like trade in national treasures or something. You just can't take it out of the country just because it's not something for the markets. So I'll stop there. These are the 2 books, Great Convergence and The Globalisation Upheaval, and thank you for your time. Oh, Q&A.
On the stage and
Right.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. That was fantastic. And I'm pleased to say there's one person in the audience, anonymous, who has been avidly asking you questions through the talk.
I can guess who that is, actually.
But we'll also have the microphone if there are people who'd rather go analogue on this one. But let me start with some of the Slido questions. There are quite a few questions around the regulatory environment for this new telemigration globotics model. Do we need a new regulatory framework? And there's one example here. For instance, how do I sue my doctor if I'm in New Zealand and a doctor operates on me from China? And also some questions around the data regulation, which I guess you've touched on. So,
Right. The first point I would make is we don't probably need a lot more regulation for this thing to get really big really fast. So in '94, we set up the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which set up the basic principles, non-discrimination, MFN, all that sort of stuff. Everybody signed on, and most of the rich countries made commitments on Mode 1 services to put up no barriers in almost all the sectors. Because back in '94, nobody ever imagined that Kenya would be exporting services to England, or at least in my cynical way, that's why. They thought there was only offensive interest, but I think they're going to find out that there's defensive interest. So this is how India increased its exports of services so fast with not signing a single free trade agreement, because it's open, and the digital moratorium on tariffs means we essentially face free trade. Now, there are lots of regulatory barriers, but especially as the service value chains disintegrate, a lot of our regulation only faces the final sales to the consumer. So an accountant has to be certified in New Zealand to sell accounting services in New Zealand, but all the background work does not have to be done by a New Zealand accountant. It just has to be signed off by it. So many of the regulatory barriers that we used to think were so important, I think, are less important because of the disintegration. Now, the ethical and legal responsibilities, I think that's a big thing, but also for digital technology. And there you might have to go, obviously the model is what they're trying to do in Europe. And as we all know, it's very hard to do. So the services directives, and that has been much harder slog than in goods. So full integration, I think that could be long ways away. But a lot of this telemigration is in the lower parts of the service value chain, which actually aren't regulated at all. So this stuff doesn't happen. So the guy who you sue will be a doctor in New Zealand, but he's using a diagnostic that was done in India. But in the end, he signs off for it. He signs his name. So that's I don't know if that's an answer to the question, but at least I talked a little while.
well, on a related note, there's another question. Will telemigration be affected by restrictions on cross-border data flows?
They can try, but I think it will be hard. Unless you go all the way to China, firewalls, the great China, it'll be hard to stop this stuff because it's just going over Skype calls and regular internet exchange. Upwork, for example, you don't need anything special to do that. So I think it would be difficult. Well, so if people really get excited about it and they want to stop it, you could use probably privacy laws and suing companies to slow it down. So I'll give you an example there with, in Switzerland, we have very strict privacy laws in financial sector. If client data leaves Switzerland by mistake, it's 300,000 franc fine per incident. If it leaves not expressly, people go to jail. So as a consequence, there's been no outsourcing of back office things in Switzerland by Swiss banks because why risk it? So all the accounting and finance and all that stuff is done actually in Switzerland with it's more or less a privacy law which has prevented trade in business processing outsourcing. So I think it could be used, but I think it would be hard. And I don't think, personally, I don't think it's going to get stopped.
A question here from Claire. Increasing inequality. I'd be interested on your views on developing labour policies alongside trade policies and potential solutions.
Right. So I think the interesting thing to say is this is not different than anything else. In fact, this is old-fashioned Ricardian trade, the way we said it would. You lower the trade barriers, and some people in your country are internationally competitive, others aren't. The ones who are competitive get to export, and the ones who aren't have to find something else to do. So the government's job is to help people move out of the sectors where they're uncompetitive into the new ones, and that's training. What's a little bit different is this is happening in cities, in the service sector, to workers who are already a little bit more flexible. So, but I think it's going to happen a lot faster. So I think the main thing is just to help people adjust. If it gets going too fast, there's other ways I talk about in the book where you could slow it down with shelterism, I try and use that word, or if things get really desperate through employment protection legislation. But that's like the nuclear option, just in case we get yellow vests combined with the LA riots and we have to slow it down immediately. We can by making it hard to fire people. And that would have bad side effects, but it would slow down the change.
Using my chair's prerogative, that shelterism, I mean, isn't that just protectionism by another name?
Yes. But they won't call it that. They're going to call it like, I'm not against technology, I just want a little shelter from the storm. You see what happened with Uber and Airbnb. The industry, wherever they were politically powerful enough to do it, used existing regulations to slow down, but rarely stop the technology from disrupting their industry. And they're not justifying themselves as protectionists. They're just saying, well, this is coming too fast. It's unfair competition, and we have to level the playing field. They use excuses like that. But it probably is old-fashioned, but it won't sound like it. Like the black cab drivers in London, when they were striking with the driving slow, they didn't think of that as protection. They thought of it as reversing an outrageous injustice that undermined what they thought was an accepted privilege.
Lots of names for non-tariff barriers there. Now I've got some more questions on Slido, but would anybody like to ask a question in person? Sir, have we got microphones?
Not so much a question as just to say thank you to Professor. I'm from Fiji, and there is a small contingent of Pacific Island diplomats in the group today. I just want to thank you. You don't realize how much mana and power you bring this morning to the Pacific Islands with the power and the depth of your message, especially with the concept of telemigration, which I think is a real game changer in the Pacific Islands, being remote and affected by climate change. And there are, of course, the infrastructure issues, professional development issues, but I just want to thank you that this is definitely something worth thinking about in the Pacific Islands, telemigration and working remotely. So I just want to thank you for the presentation this morning.
Sure. I would just point out that the Kenyan government has very explicitly made this part of their development strategy, and they're training young people to join this at the low end and the high end. And the Philippines also has decided that this is a way to employ all those young people coming into the workforce. So there are a few countries around the world who've embraced telemigration or freelancing as a way to employ young people. And you might want to look at those examples. So the IMF has done quite a lot of work on trade and services and what it means, a lot on a statistical level, but there are a number of international organizations that have engaged in it. But thank you. I'm glad I wasn't all useless this morning.
Another question here for you, Richard. This is for the economists in the room. What would, I'm sorry, I may be mispronouncing this name, Coase say, C-O-A-S-E? Coase. Yeah. Your logic implies a world of contracting with no transactions costs. Is this feasible outside of a few modular tasks?
Right. So this is happening. I'm not making this up, on freelance, on Upwork and other freelancers. there's a number of people who've gotten hold of the data sets, and they're looking at the types of contracts and projects that are done. Most of the research has been done in labor economics, and it's exactly how do you contract where there's no minimum wage, there's no contracts, there's no relationships. And to a certain extent, those platforms are creating the structure or the institutions necessary to underpin it. And just like eBay, it's essentially, on top of everything else, an insurance scheme to make sure everybody's happy. So just for example, on Upwork, one of the big problems with freelancing is the freelancer gets stiffed. You know, he does the copy editing, delivers the document on time, and then doesn't get paid. And what Upwork does is force you to put, if it's an hourly contract, forces you to put up a credit card, which is debited automatically after the hours are done, so everybody gets paid. So COS is an issue. Of course, you can't just dial up the phone and say, well, you know, can you do something for me? That's what these platforms are underpinning. But large corporations have taken it inside. So I was in Buenos Aires a couple months ago, and Amex has a whole building in downtown Buenos Aires that employs people doing Amex-like service stuff because quality adjusted, they're so cheap. And Amex employs them in Buenos Aires to do stuff that's service all over the world. And Hilton does similar things. So it is a problem. You know, this is a problem of contracting, but there have been ways to overcome it, and it's working.
Okay. And maybe just to finish, a question from an optimist about the future of work. The question is, you talked about manufacturing becoming jobless and non-traded, but won't new jobs still be created even if robots make the things, e.g. design, marketing, and so on?
Yeah, so, I mean, that's in the book I'll talk a lot about. Basically what's happening is there's job displacement and job creation. Most of the job displacement is driven by digital technology at this explosive pace. That's the business model for the AI geniuses, to eliminate jobs, service jobs. Most of them are not using that to create jobs, although on the side there is. Three main ways. One is that huge amounts of data which were just ignored by companies are now possible to use through machine translation and automation, and that creates a few jobs for humans on the side. The second is it allows customization of all sorts of current products, which was never possible before if you had to have humans doing it, and therefore creates more work in some manufacturing, like customized shoes and clothes and stuff like that. And the last one is free creates its own demand. So we're all consuming a lot more services that are free, and they're free because they're automated, but there's still a few jobs behind Instagram and WhatsApp. Not many, but there are a few jobs. But those are tiny compared to the jobs that are being displaced. So I'm an optimist in the long run. Human ingenuity will create all the jobs we need, but in the short run, I think digital technology will displace more jobs. So I'm a pessimist over the next few years, optimist in the long run.
Well, actually, that was going to be my final question to you. How long is the short run?
Well, you know, in the book, I struggled with that, so I have a whole series of quips about forecasting. And one of them is, give a number or give a date, never both. And if you ever looked at these numbers for how many jobs are displaced, you get one or the other. So I'm not going to go down that path. But it depends because it's all on nonlinear snowball effects. So the technology exists, and if everybody adopted it at the same time, there would be a massive displacement in the next 3 to 5 years. But it will depend upon companies adopting it and workers adopting it, so it's hard to say. But certainly less than 10 years I'm talking about. After 10 years, you know, the computing, we're going to have quantum computing in 10 years or so, so everything's going to be totally different. But 5 or 10 years, I think, will be rocky.
Okay. Well, on that note, would you please join me in thanking Richard for a fantastic start to today?